as Christians, we don't want to say that God is different from the Old Testament to the New Testament, but do you think you can take a stab at that a little bit of why war here and then no war over here?
Yeah, first of all, I would say that in the Old Testament, we see a lot more of sort of nonviolent and pacifist themes than might first appear. God's intention, I think, for all time has been sort of reconciliation of all things. And we see these themes throughout the Old Testament. In fact, throughout the prophecies of the Old Testament in particular, you have things that a lot of folks, eschatological prophecies or prophecies that point to the aeon when Jesus would bring the kingdom. You see things like beating swords into plowshares, that God had this intention of shalom, to use the Hebrew word. But there is still the difficulty that sometimes there's this very angry, vengeful seeming God in the Old Testament, and then the nonviolent Jesus of the New Testament. And I think that two sort of theological terms, two ways of dealing with this, are what are called divine condescension and progressive revelation. And basically summed up, that just means that God meets people where they are. God meets people in a primitive, warring culture. God meets people in a culture that's come out of slavery, and so he uses the language, for instance, of how to treat your slaves, but then later how to be a good slave. And we find that really appalling, but it's where people were at the time. So God meets people where they are and uses even their worst of tools on occasion to bring about God's good ends. And then the second is sorry, that was kind of a little bit of both all in one. That was divine condescension, that God meets people where they are, but then progressive revelation, that we see more of God than people in previous days, not because of anything we've done, but because God reveals God's self throughout time. So for instance, you see sort of a move with Abraham, and even in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt have no other God before me. So it still seems like there's this sort of dealing with the people where they were in terms of having polytheism. It's not thou shalt have no other gods, it's that you shouldn't have any other gods before me. And then very clearly, as we move through the Old Testament into the New Testament, we come into a really clear monotheism, that God is the only God, that Yahweh is the only God. And I think the same thing happens with war and violence. We see a God dealing with people in a specific place, but he has now called Christians to something different. And not only has he called us to that, but he's shown us that in Jesus and empowered us by the Holy Spirit to follow.
Now, I think I hear you saying that, I kind of think this too, is that, God deals with people where they're at and is constantly moving them forward. So, you have, Bronze Age people that God is revealing himself to and dealing with them where they're at, but he's constantly moving them forward within the culture. And you get to Jesus age, things are a lot different. But even now, he's still moving us forward and dealing with us where we are at. The term what the term for that is, that progressive revelation?
Yeah, progressive revelation, that God continues throughout time to reveal more of God's self and God's nature. And we see that even in how we understand the Trinity, right? So God in the Old Testament reveals himself, just one example, in sort of pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, tabernacle. And so you can get so close to God, but only so close, right? And then New Testament, you've got Jesus, who comes down as Emmanuel, God with us, and then is designated as friend of sinners. So real close, touch. And then we have the Holy Spirit, who is not only present in our physical midst, but actually now makes us tabernacles, that God inhabits us. So we even see that in how we understand the Trinity.
For more, make sure you check out Justin's book, Faith Not Worth Fighting For. I'll put a link down below. And Justin is going to be answering some of your questions on YouTube. So if you have a question, make sure you leave it in a comment down below, or even a video response, and you'll be able to talk to him. And if you disagree with anything that is being said, blame it on him.
I guess I won't be fighting back.
I hope you have a great day. God bless.